Very good morning to our listeners in Spain and abroad. I am Manuel Alabat, Secretary General of the Spanish think tank Incipe, based in Madrid. In a Madrid where we have a very sunny morning. Just allow me a very few welcoming words in Spanish. Muy buenos días a todos. En este nuevo acto del INCIPE en el marco de nuestro ciclo sobre la OTAN, en esta ocasión, para oír al director del Instituto Finlandés de Asuntos Internacionales, señor Aaltola, que nos va a hablar en inglés desde Helsinki. Now back to English. In this first semester of 2022, which INCIPE is devoting as a core activity to NATO, we have the pleasure to have here with us today Dr. Mika Aaltola, the director of the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, who will address our audience in English from Helsinki. Mr. Aaltola is a very distinguished and experienced Finnish scholar. He has a BA degree at Columbia University and an MA degree at Tampere University. He has been a visiting fellow at Cambridge University in the UK and also at Johns Hopkins and the University of Minnesota in the US. He is currently Professor of International Relations and European Affairs at Tallinn University in Estonia and a docent at Tampere University. He has published quite a number of works, dealing, among other matters, with the dynamics of major power politics and the US global role, as well, of course, as on Finnish foreign policy. In this very critical stage for European security, in the midst of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the role of Finland has taken center stage, as it is the European country with a longer border with Russia, more than 1,300 kilometers, and with a long history of agreements and disagreements with Moscow. So it's really a privilege to have here you today, Professor Aaltola. Your comments on the Finnish perspective of today's plight are eagerly awaited. And before giving you the floor, I will pass it to our Director General, Professor Garrido, who will briefly remind our listeners on how this event will proceed. He will then give you the floor. So, Professor Garrido, to you.
Thank you, Ambassador. The procedure today, we will follow the same one as the previous activities. You are required to pose your question at the end of the intervention of Professor Aaltola. Please don't wait until the very last moment of this today's event, because we will not have the sufficient time to formulate these questions to the speaker. Try to be brief, and I will pick up all these questions not necessarily by order of arrival, by order of affinity of topics. So I will pick up these questions, and you can also formulate your question not only through the chat in YouTube, but also using this hashtag Grandes Potencias OTAN, and through the Twitter. And then, you are welcome always to formulate these questions. So thank you so much. Please, Professor Aaltola.
Yes, thank you very much on the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be speaking in such a prestigious platform. So my big thanks for the organizers of the event. And the topic, I think, couldn't be more acute for Europe, for Finland, for the Nordic countries, for the Baltic Sea region as a whole, for Central Europe. There's quite a lot of strategic level changes that are occurring in our understanding of what Russia is, what is Russian aims, and also when it comes to Russian might. I'm myself a scholar that usually starts from Thucydides and the history of the Peloponnesian War, kind of a classical realist in my outlook to the world, which means that you look inside the political communities as well as to the relationship between them. So you include both sides of the coin in the equation. So first, perhaps we look into what Russia is in today's world. What are the aims of it? What can it achieve, or what it wanted to achieve through the aggressive actions, the war of aggression against Ukraine, in order to kind of have the bigger picture of things. And there I usually go into the power transition theories. So the Russian aim was, and it is very explicit, the aim is to change the world order with its partners, including China, into a multipolar world order. But of course, Russia doesn't have the status of a global superpower that China and US enjoys. Russia is more of a regional power, and it is using its force and its might in the European scene. We see this kind of the power transitions or attempts to power transition once or twice per century, and usually they lead into not only one war but a series of wars. And that's the kind of the bleak prognosis that I start from, that we haven't seen the worst of things to come yet. And the power transition can be stopped from happening, and that usually requires military means, and also it can be successful, and that usually requires military means. So we are experiencing a challenge for the European order. It became, or it started already back in 2008, perhaps in the Georgian War. Russia was trying out what it can achieve through military means. That war was relatively brief. It was relatively successful from the Russian perspective. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, it was kind of the first projection of force externally against an independent state, small state, Georgia. And the lessons learned from that was that Russia can achieve something when it comes to using its military might. It was more of perhaps a reactive operation, kind of a confluence of circumstances led into it. But then when we move on 7 years from 2008 to 2014, there was much more proactive stance. Russia reacted to political change in Ukraine, but it reacted with a plan. Clearly, the operation to take over and occupy Crimea was something that was pre-planned in Russia. They had existing strategic calculations regarding Crimea, and in conjunction of that, they also started a war in eastern Ukraine. So kind of the start of the first Ukrainian war in 2014 that has had significant number of casualties and victims of war since 2014. And then now, 24th of February, it started a large-scale military invasion of Ukraine, which is significant from multiple perspectives. It is extremely proactive. It aims to take over basically the political power in Ukraine. The aim was to reach Kiev in a matter of days, and it was multi-front operation. So the north, east, and south of Ukraine was attacked at the same time. So that's already significant. And if you take into consideration that Russia is the largest country in Europe by land mass, land area, attacking the second largest, territorially second largest state in Europe, Ukraine, of course we can talk about a significant challenge. But before the war started, there was already Russian demands, a long list of demands that included a demand that Russia needs to have a say in its neighborhood when it comes to security and defense. And that list also included Sweden and Finland. It also included a reversing of the Nato position in the eastern flank, basically going to the 1997 situation. So the list was long and the demands were extremely maximal. So they were aiming to reverse the security order that was established 1975 in Helsinki and then institutionalized after the end of the Cold War in the OSCE institutions. Kind of the pan-European security order was something that Russia wanted to reinterpret and revolutionize. And that was something, of course, that these countries wouldn't accept. There was a common answer given by the countries, and the answer was negative, that Russia shouldn't have a say in its neighborhood when it comes to choices made by independent sovereign states. And that kind of the bigger challenge has to be kept in mind when we are thinking about the war in Ukraine. And in Finland, looking things from a Helsinki perspective, that is something that is the kind of the central driver for changing Finnish attitudes towards NATO membership. Russia has bigger claims. The challenge is wider than Ukraine, and thereby what happens in Ukraine doesn't stay in Ukraine. Whatever is the outcome of the war in Ukraine, whether it is some kind of a ceasefire, frozen conflict, or even a peace agreement, has implications that have to be measured against the long list of demands that Russia has made. And of course, if you manage to change European borders by force, it is going to ruin the spirit of Helsinki and is going to replace the spirit with the demons of the past, where war becomes a means to an end. And that is something that, of course, is not in the best interest of European smaller states neighboring Russia, and it's not in the best interest of European Union or NATO as well. And it is a big challenge. And right now the situation is so that Russia doesn't seem to be as mighty than it thought to be. It doesn't look like what it is in the military parades during the Victory Day in Red Square in Moscow. It is much weaker than that. It is suffering defeats in Ukraine, especially when it came to ability to take over Kiev in a few days. So it has lasted now more than a month, and the Russian hands are getting bloodier. Russia is getting more toxic. Externally, it doesn't have as many friends than it thought to have. Even China has difficulties in accepting all the actions that Russia has taken. The atrocities, the mass murders in near Kiev, are something that has revealed to the world the true face of modern Russia, and that modern Russia looks pretty much the Russia that many have known in the past as well. So expansive Russia, much more centralized, autocratic, if not dictatorial. It has characteristics of facets of democracy. It holds elections, like elections were held in Soviet Union as well. But largely the elections are fabricated and the results are known beforehand. So it has facets of democracy, but underneath it is increasingly dictatorial country. And how to deal with a country like that? So the Finnish history, when it comes to relations with Soviet Union through the Cold War years and with Russia then later on, was first based on this Finlandization model. So that was forced on us after the Second World War, that Finland didn't have that much say when it came to its status in the Russian neighborhood. So Finland tried to be a neutral country, but that neutrality was never recognized by the Soviet leadership. Rather, Soviets used Finland as a model for others to follow, model of cozy coexistence between democracies and communist systems. And that was supposed to be some kind of a attractor for rest of European countries to follow. So if Finland can, in this forceful way, live happily with Soviet Union, then perhaps other Western democracies could follow that. And especially in Germany, it had some appeal, the Finnish model. Germany has Ostpolitik towards Russia or Soviet Union, and then later on Russia, and that had some similarities to the Finnish model. But of course, Germany was further away. It didn't have to kind of suffer all the consequences of what Finland suffered. So whenever somebody is recommending to a Finn that Ukraine should adopt some kind of a Finlandization model, we know that it's not a really good option for anybody. Finland doesn't desire to go back to those years. But after the Finlandization or the window dressing policy aimed towards Western Europe ended, when the Soviet Union collapsed, relations with Russia were based on hopes of democratization. So there were different types of expectations that Russia would normalize, i.e. that Russia would surrender its claims on the security of its neighbors, that it wouldn't have any claims on its neighbors. Then there was the expectation of democratization, that Russia would democratize. Then there was an expectation that it would liberalize, i.e. it would adapt to the market economy model and would compete not in military terms, but would compete in innovation economic competition between nations. That hope was one of the key drivers of the Finnish-Russian relationship until 2008, when the Georgian War happened, and that was one turning point. We understood that the good relations with Russia were difficult to maintain, and then especially after 2014, Finland decided that perhaps it's time now to move from the good relations to manageable relations with Russia, that we can somehow manage the relationship, do some good deals, gain economically from Russia, have good trading relations with Russia, and somehow can get added value out of Russia. And that period ended 24th of February when the war started in Ukraine, and the opinions in Helsinki changed quite radically when it came to how manageable the Russia relationship is. So basically right now the trade with Russia is decreasing very rapidly. Transportation over the border is getting more difficult. Finland has adapted to the sanctions set by European Union. So there's a limited but relatively strong embargo on Russia right now on the Finnish eastern border, as the kind introduction mentioned. Finland has 1,300 kilometers of eastern border. That is double the border that NATO currently has with Russia, and the Finnish experience has been that now when Russia is using war as a means of doing policy and exerting its power on its neighbors, then containment of Russia is required. So kind of a moving from relative appeasement to containment policies has happened over the past few months in Finland. And that has also opened up the NATO question in Finland. Traditionally, the Finnish defense, which is relatively speaking rather strong in Europe, the wartime army of Finland is 2,800,000, so over 250,000 is the size of Finnish defense force, which is very sizable compared to Sweden and Norway and to the Baltic countries. Besides that, it has relatively strong capabilities when it comes to Navy and Air Force. Finland has capabilities, so it is a net security contributor in the Nordic Baltic region. But the Finnish attitude has always been that the likelihood of war in Europe has required Finland to be Spartan and relatively stoic when it comes to Russia. So we always maintained the national defense, even though some of our neighbors were gearing down the defense forces, concentrating on crisis management operations. Finland never did that because of the historical experience that Russia as a great power usually is bound to challenge the order in Europe together with others, or then alone challenging the order. And that historical experience has been strong in Finland. So even after the Cold War, there was no peace dividend or any too much of a wishful thinking when it came to Russia. Now we are thinking about the NATO application. The Finnish parliament is in this extraordinary session thinking about whether or not to apply to NATO the door, according to the North Atlantic Treaty, should be open for European democracies that are stable, rule of law based democracies. So in that sense, the door should be open if NATO still adheres to its principles. Then the question becomes of the Finnish willingness and signaling that willingness very strongly in different NATO capitals, also in Madrid. So that is one of the things that the Finnish politicians and decision makers are currently thinking. The other option is to establish some kind of a Swedish-Finnish defense alliance, perhaps getting some security guarantees from US, perhaps from UK, and have kind of a halfway house between NATO membership and our current position. So kind of a splitting the difference between NATO and Finland, or NATO and Sweden. So those are the two options that politicians in Finland and Sweden are currently thinking about. So whether or not taking the big step all the way to NATO, or then a smaller step to a halfway house, kind of a solid fortification of the Nordics as a measured step. But in both cases, it would entail the changing of the Finnish status from a militarily non-aligned country to a military allied country. And that is something that is currently being thought in Finland. And the popular support for the NATO membership has dramatically shifted. It used to be around 20% for a couple of decades. Now it is around 60%. So clearly a majority of Finns are supporting NATO membership. And why is that? As I already told you, Finland is feeling a relative security because of its defense forces, because of the high willingness to defend the country. Finnish willingness to defend the country is in the 70% level, similar to Ukraine, and then I'm sure that right now it is even higher than 70%. But there's a kind of a lessons that have been learned from Ukraine, that even though you have military capabilities, you need to secure military security of supply. So you need to have resupplies, and when we have purchased new military equipment, for example, from US, we just bought 64 F-35s. Then it means that relationship needs to be on a secure footing. So we need to be able to guarantee that there's a steady flow of resupplies from our close partners, and there the NATO question becomes important. There's also a sense of collective defense in Finland. So we have always understood our defense, the defense of the 1,300 kilometers of the Russian border, to be also defense of Europe. So we see that our national defense is also collective defense. That because of our geographical location, that's kind of the burden of history that is upon us, and because of that, also the NATO question becomes a natural debate for Finns. So if our national defense is collective defense, so why not belong into a collective defense alliance? Sweden is, of course, important part of that game consideration, kind of how to face the Russia challenge. So you have the Swedish process, you have the Finnish process, you have the NATO process in Brussels, you have the processes in different NATO capitals, in Washington, for example. So it's not easy, it's complicated. As you know from the Spanish history and your decision to join NATO, it's not only a question of kind of the willingness to join NATO, but it is also a question of timing and the process of doing it, and what happens during the kind of the gray period when you are applying but you are not actually a member, and there are quite a lot of people in Finland who are seeing that there are certain worries and risks involved in this gray zone period. So how to kind of lower those risks, that is one of the key aspects. Can there be some sectoral defense guarantees while the membership application is proceeding? There's also worries that perhaps in some capitals the membership is not going to be greeted or welcomed during times of crisis, that it might be seen as kind of an escalatory move. But then again, in many capitals, there's a sense that containment of Russia is important, and a kind of a closing in and containing Russian behavior in Ukraine might be a fitting time frame also for accepting new members into NATO. So there are different views on that, but clearly now Finland is thinking about two options: the kind of the fortification of the Nordics, and then perhaps the NATO membership. I am not a decision maker. I can only give policy advice to the Finnish government, and my policy advice would be that these two steps should not be thought as separate steps, but should be considered to be kind of a complementary steps as well. So the defense alliance with Sweden will happen in any case through the NATO membership. So they should not be considered to be separate from each other. But of course, they can be kind of a one after another type of sequential moves made by Finland. And that could be then part of kind of a meeting the larger challenge posed by Russia. As I started my presentation, I was talking about the large goals that Russia has. They have failed to some degree. They have not been as mighty as we thought that they might be. The force has already met a counterforce in the willingness to defend their country by Ukrainians. So then the question becomes, does Finland need NATO membership when Russia is weaker than we thought? Actually, quite a lot of troops from the Finnish border has been transported into Ukraine, and quite many of them have been destroyed there. So in the military sense, the military threat to Finland has actually decreased because of the Ukrainian will to defend their country. So Russia is weak, but my fear, and I will conclude here, my fear is that even a weak Russia is unpredictable. Actually, it might be even more unpredictable when it is on the losing side in Ukraine. So if a great power, and we know this from the history as well, if great power cannot or is not successful in a military operation, it usually leads into perhaps finding internal enemies instead of being able to defeat external enemies. So the fight turns inside Russia. So Russia turns into even more autocratic model, even more dictatorial model. Perhaps fascism is the right word that has historical connotations in here. Kind of a jealously guarding the state against internal enemies. As you know, the Russian opposition is largely suffocated already. Many of them are in jail. So the power struggle, most likely that will happen after the Ukraine, will have to do with the purification of the leadership. So there might be those who are tempted by the situation when Putin looks weak. There might be people who might be claiming that they could have executed the military operation, the war in Ukraine, better than Putin did. So there's blame casting. There might be growing factionalism inside Russia. So there is a lot of drivers that perhaps point to Russia that is more unpredictable in the future. So even though it doesn't have kind of the external power projection capability that it thought that it has, it cannot successfully carry out operations. It still has quite a lot of arsenal left when it comes to smaller size military operations, when it comes to if not using but at least demonstrating chemical and biological, radiological systems that it has. So that unpredictable, internally focused, increasingly dictatorial, fascist political ideology of Russia as a great power will live on after Ukraine, and that means that even though Russia is a bit weaker, it still needs to be contained, and it is unpredictable, and that might be kind of the argument for creating alliances, either towards Sweden, guaranteed by US, or then joining NATO in the first place. But both of those options are now being considered simultaneously, and this is my last comment. Simultaneously, Finland has decided to increase its defense budget. That is already over 2% compared to the gross national product. Yesterday, there was a decision to increase Finnish defense budget by 700 million yearly. So we are going well beyond the 2% kind of the NATO threshold that is currently being applied. So Finland is a net security contributor. So accepting Finland into NATO would actually increase the collective territorial defense capability of NATO and facilitate the strategic planning. Let's remember that Norway is already part of NATO, and northernmost part of Norway is facing Kola Peninsula of Russia, where the Russian strategic troops are located. And then Estonia is part of NATO, which is across of the Gulf of Finland, 70 kilometers from where I am currently speaking. So NATO actually is present already in two strategically extremely important locations, the Arctic and the Gulf of Finland, the narrow strait of the Gulf of Finland. So from that angle, Finland is placed in a geopolitically or geostrategically on a map in a way that can contribute to NATO's defense planning and capabilities. But that said, Finland can also defend itself on its own. But in this unpredictable world, of course, many Finns are now thinking that in order to be prepared for contingencies that we are seeing in Ukraine, we need to have external partners and allies that are capable to contribute also to the Finnish defense and to the defense of the far north, the Baltic Sea, and whatever might then happen in the Central Europe if Russia is successful in slicing up Ukraine. It might not be that Russia stops in the peace agreement or in the frozen conflict in Ukraine. I think a peace in Ukraine is something that in the minds of Kremlin decision makers is unsustainable until they can claim that they have actually scored a victory against the West. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Artola. We have for sure a lot of questions in relation with your intervention. The first one is reflection for opening the Q&A questions. The American diplomat George Kennan spoke of the so-called strategic blunder of the eastward enlargement of NATO, fostered by the United States and the Europeans. And the American historian John Mearsheimer insists that a great deal of the blame for what we are witnessing today must go to the West. We might perhaps begin this round of questions with your analysis of this argument.
Yes, well, that's a good point. Mearsheimer's points. He is the person who also recommended Finlandization as a model for Ukraine. So he is a structural realist that thinks that you can somehow manage these power transitions in a smooth way, so that the balance of power is shifting and the institutions and the norms and the rules should reflect the underlying balance of power. and we can, without war, we can somehow facilitate that shifting power. But I think that he's too forward-leaning in his analysis, that he is kind of buying into the Russian argumentation too much. As we can see, the balance of power perhaps hasn't changed that much. The underlying balance of power, if you see the weak performance of the Russian forces in Ukraine, Russia doesn't seem to be such a great power that Mearsheimer paints Russia to be. So perhaps he is, even though he's a realist, he is kind of taking a very generous look into Russia and the need of a living space for Russia. So instead of seeing Russia as a declining power, he sees Russia as a increasing force that needs to be reckoned with by modifying the OSCE-based norms and rules and institutions. And he's willing to sacrifice the smaller states, and that's one of the criticisms that I could say towards the Mearsheimerian argument, that he's willing to sacrifice the smaller states. So kind of going back to the partitioning of Poland that actually has happened a couple of times over the past centuries, that somehow the great powers can have the responsibility and somehow smoothly partition these spheres of influence and reshape the order in Europe. And of course, kind of from the small state perspective, that type of argumentation is unsustainable. First, such agreements between great powers to slice spheres of influence usually lead into wars in any case, because the causes of war then becomes over the jealousy in gaining kind of an upper hand in the games of spheres of interest. So it cannot be managed smoothly in any case. And then perhaps he also underestimates the importance of ideological and ideational factors like democratic solidarity, for example. So he doesn't look into the states. He doesn't see the internal weaknesses of the states. He just sees them as billiard balls that are moving on a billiard table, and the bigger the ball, the more damage the ball can make to other balls, and thereby it would, from his perspective, it would be reasonable to allow the bigger balls to move as smoothly as possible. So I think his basic analysis is wrong of the situation, and his proposals of smoothening and kind of understanding Russian positions underestimate the unsustainability of Russia internally, its aggressiveness, the basic challenge that it is posing, and generally speaking, he is not paying attention to the right characteristics of the ongoing conflict that also includes strong ideological component as well.
Thank you, Professor. Sweden Prime Minister said that this was not the time for Sweden to request NATO membership. On the other hand, Finland seems to be going to the opposite way. Do you foresee a joint position on this very critical issue? And if not in the short term, NATO membership is in store for your two countries, what would be the alternative in the present situation?
Well, as I said, that one alternative is kind of a Nordic military alliance, but then is that feasible? Because then you would have to create something that doesn't exist from the ground up in a short period of time. Of course, there's military cooperation between Sweden and Finland already. But the question is right in the sense that it is ideal that Finland and Sweden go hand in hand in this process. Sweden, of course, has its vulnerabilities as well when it comes to Baltic Sea, Gotland, when it comes to Kaliningrad area in Russia, the westernmost part of Russia. So there's a kind of a common shared geopolitical situation between these two countries. And they have a similar strategic culture as well. You have to remember that Finland and Sweden used to be part of the same empire for 750 years, and the legacies of that time are still very much present in Finland and Sweden. And that might be one of the reasons why we are jointly thinking about these things. So there's common Nordic roots, common Nordic understanding of the value of rule of law, for example. There's a tradition of relative non-alignment or neutrality in both countries, but there has always been also a lot of cooperation, military cooperation as well. So I would tend to think that the likelihood that they will jointly do their decisions is bigger than that they would go separate ways. You have to also remember when Finland and Sweden decided to apply for the European Union membership, they joined together at the end. They both arranged a referendum and both joined European Union. So there's kind of a historical legacy of acting, relatively speaking, acting together. So now both countries are in a close contact. They have a little bit different traditions. Finland doesn't have neutral status. Whenever somebody says that Finland, foreign media outlet says that Finland is neutral in Finland, we are disagreeing with that position because Finland is not neutral anymore politically. It's military non-aligned. But Sweden has this tradition of neutrality, and in different forms it has been neutral for 200 years, over 200 years since the Napoleonic Wars. And so there are differences, but I would suspect that at the end there's going to be a common solution because the threat is shared and strategic cultures are similar in Sweden and Finland.
Thank you. Admiral Trevino asked if you consider that the war between Russia and Ukraine could we have avoided or having similarities with the Winter War of Finland with Russia in 1939, it was unavoidable.
Yeah, well,
we have some troubles with the sound. Wait. I think we have it. Wait a minute still. Sorry for the interruption, but I think that Mr. Altola has activated the mute and we can't hear anything. I hope that you can see me and sorry, Mr. Altola. Well, sorry for the interruption here. I hope that Mr. Artora can see me and activate again the sound. Oh, it's no. Well, I wonder if you could catch my indications, but I will pose again the same question. We couldn't follow what you were saying because you were muted by the phone didn't the sound didn't work. Well, maybe now, if you can please go back to the same question. No, it's no way, sorry. I wonder if you can see me, Professor Artola, because you activated before the mute in your phone, and we
Okay.
didn't hear anything that you were saying.
Okay. So, well, I was just pointing out, the importance of avoiding any spheres of influence. They are unsustainable, and Russia wanted to do that over Ukraine. And the cause of Winter War was the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement in 1939, when Germany and Soviet Union divided spheres of influence in the Nordic Baltic region. So, to think that spheres of influence would be a solution to anything, I think history has shown that they are not. They are usually unsustainable, and they usually lead into wars in a relative short period of time. So Ukraine should not have accepted anything like that before the war, and Finland didn't accept the Molotov-Ribbentrop division of spheres of influence. So basically against the idea that blaming the victim leads to any constructive solution to Ukraine, the war of aggression in Ukraine.
Thank you. Do you think that the West, and especially NATO, should intervene in military terms in a direct way in Ukraine, as requested by President Zelensky, but not only Zelensky, but also Poland and Lithuania, among other Baltic states?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. I don't think that the Third World War would help Ukraine. So it sounds horrible that we are insulating the conflict into Ukraine, but still kind of the dangers of escalation are present, and we should avoid escalating it. So basically, going into Ukraine right now can have potentials for escalation, and we should contain the war. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't help Ukrainians. I'm sure that that what we are currently doing, supplying arms to Ukraine, that can be sustained and increased to new weapon systems as well. What they need is air defense, but establishing a no-fly zone in Ukraine could have dangerous ramifications. So, as Kissinger put it once, that if you have two nuclear powers, nuclear weapon states fighting, that can easily escalate out of control, go into nuclear level. So what is sensible in these circumstances is to try to avoid a direct conflict between nuclear powers. But the price for that is horrible for the Ukrainians, because they have to suffer kind of defending the European freedoms, democratic values. The Ukrainians are taking a horrible burden over that. So helping them, through economic sanctions and also giving them weapons that they need, I think is the reasonable thing to do, and it can avoid the risks of escalation. And there's two types of escalations. It can geographically escalate. Wars have their own dynamics. They are beasts that are difficult to control once they are out of the box when they have started, and then they can escalate when it comes to intensity of destruction and the weapons that are used. So in order to avoid those escalations, I think it is useful to give them weapons that they need, but we don't need to intervene in Ukraine. I think that the Ukrainians are quite capable of handling this situation if they have the means of doing so.
Yeah, regarding democracy, will the invasion lead to an increase in international commitments to support democracy, or will democracy issues get displaced by a more security-focused foreign policy?
Well, I think security is going to be on the foreground, and COVID-19 already pointed out how important the kind of the national safety nets are for citizens. So sovereignty is back, and war in Ukraine is going to emphasize that sovereignty once again. But of course, democracy is also back. So what Russia, and this is one of the most difficult to understand things about Russia. It was quite successful in meddling in cleavaging, in creating shadow financial networks, money laundering systems, making deals that separated the interests of different European countries and weakened democracies and created vulnerabilities, election meddling. So Russia was quite successful in all of that. So how the strategic practice that divided European countries and also weakened democracies, how they shifted from that into strategic tool of war that usually always unites. So Russia has actually managed to give us the poison of democratic vulnerability, but they have also managed to give the antidote, which is a common threat that unites. So I think that Russia has managed to strengthen democracies, at least on the short term. So this momentum inside the European Union, for example, in taking relatively strong decisions when it comes to sanctions, I think shows a kind of a democratic solidarity that Russia didn't see forthcoming. So there has been quite a lot of mistakes made. If I would be a strategic analyst in Moscow, I would be thinking and scratching my head that how come these these mistakes have been made? How come miscalculations have been made that are very dramatic when it comes to European perception of Russian power? But on the short term, at least, I think that democracies are getting stronger because we can see ramifications of autocracy and more dictatorial political systems, how destructive they can be both externally and internally.
Thank you. In the context of the disinformation operations in the Ukrainian war, is Finland a target of Russian influence activities?
Well, of course, it is to a degree, but Finns are very stubborn. So whenever we detect some Russian trolling, for example, it usually has a impact that is counter to the interest of Russia. So Russia hasn't been very successful when it comes to its disinformation operations in Finland. We have seen some cyber-related events, but those are manageable. They are not existential by any means. So I wouldn't overestimate. One of the biggest fallacies, I suppose, or biases that we have had is that we overestimate Russian power. Russia is weaker than we thought. Also, when it comes to its operations that create cleavages, we should not overemphasize Russian power. I think that is one of the lessons learned from Ukraine. They haven't been very successful in Finland. The NATO support has gone up from 20% to 60%. Finland is increasing its defense budget. It's buying American fighter planes. So if that is a success, I don't know what is the measure of success then. It seems to be a big failure for us.
Thank you, Professor Artola. We have 3 last questions. What about people, personal identity in Karelia? Do you consider themselves Russians, or do you have mixed identities as in many other borders regions?
Well, there's history when it comes to Finnish eastern border, and that history is written in wars and conflicts. Finnish identity is relatively homogeneous. One of the most homogeneous countries, I suppose, in Europe when it comes to ethnicity and culture and language. We have 1% of Russian speakers in Finland. And one thing that Finns usually always remember to do is to make a distinction between Russia as a state and the state practices of Russia, and then on the other hand, Russians as people. So Finns usually do not linger any suspicions when it comes to Russians. But of course, we are suspicious of the Russian leadership. It seems that we cannot trust the Russian leadership that much. So there's a distinction there. But when you look into opinion polls from different corners of Finland, they seem to be relatively uniform when it comes to 2 things: NATO question and then a negativity number of Russia. So if people ask the question how they see Russia and how they view Russia, the negativity is around 60 to 70%. Very similar to the negativity number of Russia in US, where 70-80% of Americans hold Russia in negative light. And that's a dramatic change over the last 10 years, that negativity number has increased very dramatically.
Thank you. Ambassador Manuel de la Cámara asks, what is Finland doing as regards its energy imports from Russia?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. Of course, Russian oil, much of that is kind of refined in Finland. So we import raw materials, forestry, wood, oil, from Russia, and that has been a relatively important part of the Finnish economy. But then again, oil you can get elsewhere as well. So that's not a big issue. Forestry, that's a little bit bigger issue, but we have forests in Finland. But it is a little bit bigger issue, but it's not it's a manageable issue again. And then gas, in Finland we import around 90% of the gas from Russia, but because of the historical experiences with Russians, those gas-based energy can be compensated by other means very easily. So there has been always an understanding that you need to have resilience in that respect. So it is a fraction of Finnish energy consumption, the Russian gas at the end. So that's not the biggest obstacle here. Of course, the other businesses, tourism, trade, investments, we are losing those, and those are of course important. Russia used to be our 5th largest trading partner, and now it is dramatically going down. But in Finland, there's general feeling that of course, in economic inconveniences should not be thought to be more important than the security of the country. So there's a willingness to take on some economic suffering because of necessities, geopolitical security-based necessities.
Finally, the war goes on, and there is not an in sight. We seem to need a very desperately and credible mediator to broker first its ceasefire and then some kind of a compromise. China, Israel, and Turkey have been mentioned, to no avail, at least for the moment. In this respect, Finland seems to be the European country that knows Russia the best, as you already mentioned. Could the president of Finland be that long-awaited mediator? And if a compromise was to be reached, what kind of concessions could be made to Russia that would not cross Western red lines?
Well, the last part of the question, that's most difficult, because you have to remember that what happens to Ukraine doesn't stay in Ukraine. So there's 3 countries that are not part of NATO that are on the western border of Russia, and those are Ukraine, Belarus, and Finland. And so if there is some kind of a compromise in Ukraine, that can have ramifications to Finland. So of course the Finnish view is that there should not be any compromises, or if there's compromises, those should be kind of exceptional compromises. And it is very difficult to justify those. So Finland, in the first place, doesn't want to be a mediator in this conflict. But what it has tried to do is to facilitate the humanitarian situation, giving some humanitarian relief to Ukrainians, corridors out of Mariupol. But even in there, the Finnish role has not been as important as the French role or the Turkish role. But Finland is not in between Russia and Ukraine. It is firmly on the Ukrainian side. So we cannot be a mediator in that sense of the word. But we can facilitate, of course, things. But the outcome has to be sustainable. And the situation right now is not ripe for any meaningful diplomacy, because actually diplomacy now is part of the war itself. So if there's a ceasefire, it is most likely to be broken very soon. It is just time to replenish the troops and try to gain a military upper hand. So the negotiation table is part of the war right now. So, but perhaps there comes a time when Russia is overextended and overexhausted.
Well, we have the same problem now, and
So
now,
did you hear what I said?
yeah, the last 5 minutes, maybe not, but we couldn't follow you so far.
Yes. Yeah. So, when the Russians are overextended and overexhausted, perhaps that's the situation when negotiations are meaningful. But right now, in the middle of the war, when the situation in the battlefield is very fluid, diplomacy just becomes an extension of the battlefield. So right now, it's difficult to see what would be the outcome. People are talking about kind of about Ukraine not being able to join NATO. That was out of the cards for many years already. But could there be some kind of external guarantees for Ukrainian security? That's a key question. Who would give those guarantees to Ukraine? And what are the territorial consequences regarding Crimea, regarding eastern part of Ukraine? It could be that frozen conflict is the outcome, most likely outcome, instead of peace agreement or ceasefires that are usually broken. But for frozen conflict is going to stay with us. It's going to haunt us for years and years. So I don't see that this is going to end anytime soon. It's going to take years at least. The management of the aftermath and the broken soul of Europe, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes years, perhaps a generation, to fully come into terms with what has happened in Ukraine.
Thank you, Professor Artola. We had still a couple of questions, but we have run out of time, and unfortunately, we have to conclude this interesting debate that will still be, unfortunately, in the mass media and in the academia for a long time, I assume. Well, before we conclude, please, I wanted to give the floor to Ambassador Manuel Alabar, Secretary General of INCIPE. Please, Manuel.
Thank you, Vicente, and thank you very much, Professor Artola, for this extremely interesting talk. I think it will be food for thought for all our listeners in Spain and abroad. I could point out many things you've said which are extremely interesting. Perhaps let me just make reference to two or three. You've characterized Russia as a regional power. It reminds me, and not a global power, it reminds me of what President Obama said a few years ago about Russia. I was worried, but you are probably right that we haven't seen the worst yet. And because Russia is very unpredictable, worse things may yet be in store in this terrible situation. You said that Russia has bigger claims than Ukraine, and that, of course, is extremely worrisome, and that we are in for a long and frozen conflict. So, my goodness, this is going to be terrible. I was extremely interested, and I think it's going to be interesting to our listeners, the fact that Finland is in a big debate about whether to join NATO or not join NATO, and under what circumstances to join NATO, along or without Sweden. I understand the debate is in the Finnish parliament right now, and that, of course, the basis for this debate is that you seem to have shifted, you seem to have moved from appeasement to containment as far as Russia is concerned. So we'll see what happens with your debate. We'll follow it very closely. And I suppose that issue will come up in some form or another in the Madrid NATO summit, which is going to be held here in Madrid at the end of June. So thanks a lot for extremely interesting talk. Please consider, Professor Altola, our wish to continue this cooperation between our two institutes in the future. I think in this specific subject of the war in Ukraine, we'll have to rely a lot on your judgments. You are just close to the front line. May I remind our listeners our next event, which is going to take place on April the 21st. We're going back to a very critical country also in this war, which is Turkey. We already had on March 8th Ambassador Taçanildem, the head of EDAM, the main Turkish think tank. Now we're going to have on the 21st of April the director of the Center for Strategic Studies in Ankara, Mr. Ulutus, who will give us a talk on Turkish foreign policy, especially related to this issue. So thank you very much all. Have a very good day. And again, Professor Altola, thanks a lot. It was great to have you here today. So
Thank you
long.
very much.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.